21st October, the day in history. October 21st, a date that echoes through time. From the roar of cannons on the high seas to the spark that lit the modern world. From the birth of legends to the dawn of inventions that shaped our everyday. This isn't just another page in history. It's a day that redefined courage, creativity, and the human spirit. So tighten your seatbelt, open your mind, and step with me into the stories that made October 21st unforgettable. Number 1. The Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. The year was 1805. Europe was burning under the ambitions of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. His armies had crushed kingdoms, redrawn maps, and made emperors kneel. But on the vast, unpredictable waters of the Atlantic, a different kind of battle was brewing, one that would decide the fate of Britain, France, and Spain for generations. The early morning of October 21st, 1805, dawned gray and misty off the coast of Cape Trafalgar, near Spain. The wind carried the scent of salt and the uneasy rhythm of drums and shouts across the decks of ships. On one side, the British Royal Navy, commanded by Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, waited in a tight formation. On the other, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet under Admiral Villeneuve stretched across the horizon like a dark, rolling tide. Nelson stood on the deck of his flagship, the HMS Victory, a calm yet fierce presence. He wore his signature Navy coat, decorated with medals, one arm missing, a patch over his blind eye. He wasn't just a commander, he was a symbol. The sailors looked at him and saw hope, a man who had faced the impossible and won. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Napoleon's forces were preparing to invade Britain, and if Villeneuve's fleet succeeded, the English Channel would become the road to conquest. At 11:45 a.m., Nelson gave his immortal signal, a message that would go down in history. England expects that every man will do his duty. The words flashed across the flags, rippling in the sea breeze, and were met with thunderous cheers. Every sailor, every gunner, every boy aboard the British fleet knew that this was not just a battle, it was destiny. As the fleets closed in, the silence shattered, cannons roared, the sea erupted in smoke and fire. Splinters flew through the air as iron balls tore into wood and flesh alike. The Victory drove straight into the enemy line, breaking it like a spear through the heart. Nelson's strategy, unconventional, daring, almost suicidal, was working. Rather than fighting broadside to broadside, he sliced through their formation, creating chaos where there had been order. For hours the battle raged. Smoke blanketed the ocean. Voices shouted orders drowned by the thunder of guns. Flames licked the decks of burning ships. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air. Then, tragedy struck. A French sniper, hidden high in the rigging of the Redoubtable, took aim at Nelson. The shot rang out, piercing his shoulder and lodging in his spine. Nelson collapsed, whispering only, "They've done for me at last." He was carried below deck, where his loyal men gathered around him. Even as life slipped away, he could hear the Victory unfolding above. By 4:30 p.m., the battle was over. The Franco-Spanish fleet was shattered, 22 of their 33 ships captured or destroyed. Britain's naval supremacy was absolute. The invasion of Britain was abandoned forever. And on that same deck, beneath the sounds of celebration, Nelson drew his last breath, murmuring his final words, "Thank God, I have done my duty." He died at the very moment of triumph, the kind of poetic, tragic ending that history never forgets. The aftermath of Trafalgar reshaped the world. Britain would rule the seas for the next century, its navy unmatched. Napoleon's dreams of invading the island nation died that day on the waves. Across Europe, the legend of Nelson became mythic. Songs were written, statues raised, and sailors whispered his name like a prayer. But beyond the grandeur, the Battle of Trafalgar remains a story of sacrifice, of men who faced the impossible and won. It wasn't just about strategy or empire, it was about courage in the face of certain death. Imagine standing on a wooden deck, cannonballs whistling overhead, watching your friends fall beside you, and still pressing forward. That's what Trafalgar was. It's strange to think that so much of our world, the balance of power, the British Empire, even global trade routes, might have been entirely different if not for that single morning in October 1805. Today, the HMS Victory still stands in Portsmouth, lovingly preserved, a time capsule of bravery. Visitors walk its decks, their footsteps echoing where Nelson once stood. You can still feel the ghosts of that day, whispering through the wood, telling you that some victories come at the greatest price. Every October 21st, history doesn't just remember the Battle of Trafalgar. It relives it. The day the wind carried England's fate, and one man's courage became eternal. Number 2, Thomas Edison's light bulb, breakthrough, 1879. Narrator, warm, steady. Imagine a world lit by flame and shadow. Candle smoke curling under high ceilings, gaslight flickering in parlor windows, streets lit unevenly by the hiss and sputter of public lamps. It was the 19th century, brilliant, noisy, hopeful, yet still living in pockets of darkness. For centuries, humans chased the dream of safe, steady light that could banish night on demand. On October 21, 1879, that chase took a decisive step forward. Not because a single bulb suddenly changed everything, but because one man's relentless tinkering pushed a fragile filament to glow long enough for the world to begin to imagine a different night. That man was Thomas Alva Edison, a name now synonymous with invention. But Edison's legacy isn't a single lightning strike. It's a relentless series of small fires, some burned out, others fanned into brilliance by stubborn hands and sleepless nights. The Age of Darkness. In the mid-1800s, illumination was a logistical nightmare. Candles were expensive and hazardous. Gaslight required urban infrastructure and was a fire risk. Arc lamps, marvels that could light whole streets, were blinding and impractical for indoor homes. Industry and theater needed something safer, affordable, and usable in every household. Simply put, light that behaved. Edison understood the demand not just as an engineer, but as an entrepreneur. He saw potential markets, factories, streets, and parlors that could be transformed. He imagined a future where shops stayed open after dusk, where factories could run 2 shifts, where families could study at night with steady light. But to build that future, Edison needed a practical electric lamp, inexpensive, reliable, and capable of sustained use. The Laboratory of Gumption. Edison A.S. Menlo Park Laboratory in New Jersey was less a tidy workshop and more a human beehive. Craftsmen, glassblowers, chemists, metalworkers, and itinerant experimenters banging, molding, and arguing late into the night. Edison himself was a force, a manager of possibilities who worked methodically but believed in brute persistence. He organized teams, kept meticulous notebooks, and encouraged a culture of try and try again. He famously said with characteristic bluntness that he didn't fail. He found 10,000 ways that won't work. It's a cliche now, but the weight of those thousands of small failures is what allowed him to stumble eventually into a working solution. The filament question. At the heart of the problem lay the filament, a thin thread inside a glass bulb that must resist burning while conducting electric current and glowing with enough intensity to produce light. Early experimenters had produced brief glows, flashes that lasted moments before the filament burned away in the presence of oxygen or broke under heat stress. Some used platinum filaments, sturdy but prohibitively expensive. Edison's genius wasn't inventing electricity, nor was it inventing the concept of a light-emitting filament. It was his methodical engineering approach, controlling the bulb's atmosphere, experimenting with filament materials, and building entire systems, from generators to switches, so the lamp could be practical for everyday life. He tested carbonized plant fibers, experimenting with bamboo, cotton, and assorted threads. He examined metal wires, studied vacuum techniques to remove oxygen, and considered filament shapes and mounting methods that would withstand heat. Each trial informed the next. October 21st, 1879, the glow that endured. By the autumn of 1879, the Menlo Park team had refined several components: a better vacuum pump, a more effective bulb shape, and mounting that reduced filament stress. On October 21st, Edison and his assistants were not searching for drama. They were running another careful trial. They inserted a carbonized filament, evacuated the bulb to a high vacuum, connected it to a DC power source, and waited. When the current passed, the filament began to glow. Not a fleeting spark, but a steady, soft orange light. It lasted hours, then longer. When the bulb remained lit through the night and continued into the next day, the lab erupted in restrained triumph. This was not the absolute perfection Edison would later chase, but it proved that a practical incandescent lamp was possible. Edison reported later, "The best carbon filament he and his team had found was from carbonized bamboo, which, under their conditions, lasted surprisingly long. This was a turning point. If a filament could glow for many hours without burning out in a vacuum, then electric light could be commercialized. More than a bulb. Building a system." Edison was acutely aware that an invention is only useful when it fits into a workable system. So while journalists and townsfolk would later remember a glowing bulb, Edison's real labor that fall was bigger. He developed the electric distribution system, dynamos, generators, capable of producing steady current, wiring that could safely deliver electricity, metering for customers, and fixtures to make the bulbs usable in homes and factories. Menlo Park became the seed of a larger vision, an urban grid of electric light. He built the first practical power station in 1882 in Manhattan, Pearl Street Station, proving a model where a single generator could serve multiple customers. Once neighborhoods could be electrified, the incandescent lamp was not a novelty, but a foundation for a new urban life. Shops stayed open later, theaters experimented with new lighting techniques, and industry could expand productivity. Cities were remade, doubters, critics, and the business of light. Not everyone applauded. Competitors and skeptics blasted Edison's approach. Tinkerers promoted alternating current systems. Industrialists argued technical feasibility, and some lamp makers derided the brittle bulbs as toys. Edison engaged in fierce battles, legally and scientifically, to protect his patents and to push his direct current systems into the market. What Edison mastered was manufacturing scale. He didn't just show that a bulb could glow. He established ways to make thousands of consistent bulbs, a supply chain for filaments, and a commercial network to profit from electrification. That was the true leap from experiment to revolution. The human effect. Think for a moment about the cultural shift. A student could study after sunset without hazard. Families could gather under steady light. Hospitals could perform night surgeries with better visibility. Streets lit by electric lamps reduced crime and extended commerce. Art and cinema would later flourish under controlled electrical lighting. The incandescent lamp became a quiet engine of social change. Edison's light also reframed time itself. Workdays lengthened, nightlife grew, and human schedules shifted. In subtle ways, the glow from that little filament changed rhythms of sleep, work, and leisure. The world bent toward the light. A complicated legacy. Edison's incandescent bulb is not a flawless monument. Early bulbs consumed much energy, and later technologies, fluorescent and LED, would eclipse incandescent efficiency. Controversies also shadowed Edison, fierce patent fights, disputes with rivals like Nikola Tesla over alternating current, and criticisms about how he treated collaborators. His persona blended brilliance with ruthless business strategy. Still, the October night in 1879, where a carbonized filament glowed steadily for hours, stands as a hinge in history. It showed that the dream of everyday electric light was no longer fantasy, but achievable reality. When you flick a switch tonight, pause for a second and consider the lineage of that simple gesture. A world of steady light began under the hands of grinders and glassblowers, under the bright, tired eyes of men and women who tested thousands of filaments. Edison's lamp did not spring fully formed. It was coaxed into life by patience, trial, and careful engineering. On October 21, 1879, a small laboratory in New Jersey took one of the human race older needs to push back the dark and translated it into a scalable technology. The glow from that filament was more than convenience. It was a signal. Humanity could bend nature to its comfort, and the night would never be quite the same again. Number 3. The Guggenheim Museum opens. 1959, when art found its revolution in concrete and light. On the morning of October 21st, 1959, New York City woke up to something unlike anything it had ever seen before. Amid the buzzing traffic of Fifth Avenue, where the city's pulse throbbed with ambition and motion, a strange white spiraling structure stood proudly near Central Park. Some called it a masterpiece, others whispered it was madness made concrete. That building was the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and its opening marked not just a milestone in architecture but a complete reimagining of how humanity viewed, experienced, and interacted with art. The dream of Solomon Guggenheim and Hilla Rebay. The story began decades before that crisp October morning, with Solomon R. Guggenheim, an American industrialist who, after amassing immense wealth, found himself drawn not to business empires but to the bold frontiers of modern art. Guided by Hilla von Rebay, a German artist, and his artistic advisor, Guggenheim began collecting abstract art long before it was fashionable or even understood. To most of society, these abstract forms, swirls, lines, and unrecognizable shapes seemed chaotic. But to Guggenheim and Rebay, they represented a spiritual evolution of humanity. They wanted a museum that could reflect this idea, a temple for the imagination, a space that transcended the conventional box-shaped galleries of old. Thus began a collaboration that would reshape not just architecture, but the very soul of modern art. Enter Frank Lloyd Wright, the visionary architect. To bring their dream to life, Guggenheim and Rebay approached Frank Lloyd Wright, one of America's most celebrated architects, and one of its most stubborn. By the time he accepted the commission in 1943, Wright was in his mid-70s, a man who had already defied architectural norms across the world. When asked to design a museum, Wright didn't want to create a container for art. He wanted to create a living, breathing experience, a building that was art itself. Art, Wright said, should not be confined in boxes. So he sketched what he called an inverted ziggurat, a structure that spiraled upward, resembling a seashell or a ribbon unwinding toward the sky. His design was bold, futuristic, and deeply organic. He wanted people to walk through the museum as if gliding through a continuous journey, free from the confinement of square rooms and flat floors. A struggle against convention. But Wright's vision wasn't easy to realize. For years, his design faced fierce opposition. Art critics, traditional architects, and even some of Guggenheim's trustees believed it would overshadow the art it was meant to display. Others thought it looked too alien for the classical streets of Manhattan. Construction delays, funding struggles, and the death of Solomon Guggenheim in 1949 nearly ended the dream. Wright himself passed away just months before the museum opened. But his legacy, like all revolutionary art, could not be silenced. On October 21, 1959, the Guggenheim finally opened its doors, a gleaming white spiral rising 92 feet high, its smooth curves breaking the skyline like a whisper of the future, a building that redefined art. Walking inside the Guggenheim for the first time was an experience unlike any other. Instead of climbing stairs between rooms, visitors began at the top of the spiral and slowly descended along a gently sloping ramp that wound around a vast open atrium. The artwork wasn't just hung, it flowed, guiding viewers through an emotional and visual journey. Sunlight streamed from a domed skylight, illuminating the central space like a sacred chamber. Paintings by Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Marc Chagall, and Pablo Picasso adorned the curved walls, their abstract forms blending perfectly with Wright's organic design. It was as if architecture and art had fused into one language. For the first time, people weren't just observing art, they were moving through it. Reactions, awe and controversy. Reactions to the museum were explosive. Some critics hailed it as a masterpiece that redefined the relationship between space and art. Others called it an eyesore that distracted from the very works it was supposed to showcase. One journalist wrote, "It's the most beautiful building in America, or the ugliest. There is no middle ground." Even artists had divided opinions. Some complained that the sloping walls made it difficult to hang paintings. Others, however, felt liberated. The building gave their work a stage that felt alive, dynamic, and unrestrained. But despite the controversies, the Guggenheim quickly became a magnet for visitors. People from around the world flocked not just to see the art, but to witness the building itself, a sculptural masterpiece that defied everything they thought they knew about museums. A revolution in design. Frank Lloyd Wright's genius lay in his philosophy of organic architecture, the idea that a building should grow naturally from its environment, like a living organism. The Guggenheim embodied that philosophy perfectly. Its spiral ramp symbolized progress, a continuous flow of creativity that mirrored the evolution of modern art. Its central atrium, bathed in natural light, created a sense of openness and possibility. Every detail, from the gentle curvature of the walls to the way light shifted throughout the day, was designed to evoke emotion. It wasn't just architecture, it was storytelling in stone and glass, cultural impact and global influence. Over the years, the Guggenheim became far more than a museum. It became a symbol of artistic freedom and architectural courage. It challenged the world to rethink what a cultural space could be. Today, the museum holds one of the finest collections of modern and contemporary art on the planet. From Jackson Pollock's abstract explosions to Kandinsky's spiritual compositions, its galleries capture the restless energy of human creativity. The Guggenheim Foundation expanded its vision globally, opening sister museums in Bilbao, Venice, and Abu Dhabi, each one unique yet carrying the same spirit of innovation. The Guggenheim Bilbao, in particular, designed by Frank Gehry, sparked what many call the Bilbao effect, the idea that a single bold building can revive an entire city's cultural and economic life. All of this traces back to that one white spiral on Fifth Avenue, the day art dared to break free from its frame. The spirit of Wright and Guggenheim lives on. It's poetic. Really, both Frank Lloyd Wright and Solomon Guggenheim never lived to see the full glory of their creation, and yet their vision continues to breathe life into the museum every single day. The Guggenheim remains timeless because it doesn't belong to one era or style. It belongs to the eternal human desire to imagine, to dream, and to create. Every visitor who walks that spiraling path is retracing the journey of innovation itself, from confusion to wonder, from resistance to revelation. A living poem in concrete. When you stand inside the Guggenheim and look up, you feel something indescribable. The circular skylight, a kaleidoscope of daylight, seems to pull you upward, as if inviting your thoughts to spiral beyond the ceiling into the infinite. The building doesn't just contain art. It reminds you that you are part of it. That was Wright's genius. He didn't design for the eye alone. He designed for the soul. Legacy of October 21st, 1959. Decades later, the Guggenheim remains one of the most photographed, most studied, and most beloved buildings in the world. It is a permanent reminder that art is not confined to the canvas. It is all around us in the shapes we dare to build, the rules we dare to break, and the stories we choose to tell. In many ways, October 21st, 1959, was the day the world stopped seeing museums as dusty archives of the past and started seeing them as gateways to the future. So next time you walk past that white spiral on Fifth Avenue, remember, you're not just looking at a building. You're standing before a revolution in concrete, light, and imagination, one that began with a dreamer, a rebel architect, and a belief that art, like life, should always keep moving forward. Number 4. The Battle of Leyte Gulf begins, 1944. The ocean that burned with destiny. The morning of October 21st, 1944, dawned over the Philippine Sea with a deceptive calm. The sun shimmered over the Pacific waves, and to the untrained eye, the horizon seemed peaceful. But beneath that golden light, one of the most epic confrontations in human history was about to erupt. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. The largest naval battle ever fought, and a moment that forever shifted the balance of World War II. It wasn't just a clash of fleets. It was the thunderous culmination of ambition, courage, and redemption. For the Allies, it marked the long-awaited beginning of the liberation of the Philippines. For Japan, it was a desperate gamble, a final, furious attempt to halt an enemy that had already begun knocking at the gates of their homeland. And at the heart of it all stood one man, General Douglas MacArthur, returning to fulfill his legendary promise, "I shall return." The stage was set, a promise and a plan. 2 years earlier, in 1942, MacArthur had been forced to withdraw from the Philippines after the devastating fall of Bataan and Corregidor. Standing on the shores of Australia, he uttered those now immortal words, "I shall return." That promise became more than just a personal vow. It became a rallying cry for millions of Filipinos and Allied soldiers alike. And on October 20th, 1944, MacArthur made good on his word, wading ashore on the island of Leyte as cameras captured the moment that would echo through time. But even as his boots touched the sand, the Japanese Imperial Navy was already preparing to strike back, with everything they had left. The very next day, October 21st, the Pacific roared to life. The Empire strikes back, Japan's final gambit. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's situation was dire. Its empire, once stretching from Burma to the Solomons, was collapsing. American submarines had strangled its supply lines, and Allied bombers were devastating its cities. But the Japanese High Command was not ready to surrender. They devised an audacious plan called Operation Shogo, a complex, all-or-nothing strategy designed to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap. 3 Japanese naval forces would converge around the Philippines from different directions. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would steam through the Sibuyan Sea and San Bernardino Strait. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, a decoy fleet, would come from the north, using aircraft carriers as bait. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would attack through the Surigao Strait. Their goal, to converge on Leyte Gulf, annihilate the American invasion fleet, and destroy the fragile beachhead before reinforcements could arrive. It was a plan born of desperation, and one that would turn the sea into a cauldron of fire and steel. The sky explodes, the prelude to chaos. On October 21st, as Allied troops secured their positions on Leyte's beaches, Japanese bombers launched a furious counterattack. From the skies came waves of Mitsubishi Zero fighters and kamikaze pilots, diving fearlessly into the flak-filled heavens. For the first time, the Allies witnessed the terrifying new weapon of the Japanese war machine, the kamikaze. These suicide pilots were ordered to crash their explosive-laden planes directly into Allied ships, turning themselves into human missiles. When one kamikaze slammed into the Australian cruiser HMS Australia, the explosion was horrific. Dozens were killed. The ship was crippled. The era of kamikaze warfare had begun. It was a grim preview of the hell that was about to unfold. The largest naval battle in history. Over the next 4 days, from October 21 to October 25, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf would rage across 100,000 square miles of ocean. It involved more than 300 ships, 800 aircraft, and nearly 200,000 men. It wasn't just one battle. It was 4 colossal engagements fought simultaneously across the sea. Each confrontation had its own drama, its own heroes, and its own heartbreaks. 1. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, where the Japanese super battleship Musashi, one of the heaviest ever built, was pummeled and sunk by relentless American airstrikes. 2. The Battle of Surigao Strait, where U.S. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf executed the last battleship-to-battleship gun duel in history, annihilating the Japanese southern force in a crossfire that felt almost biblical. 3. The Battle off Cape Engano, where Ozawa's decoy carriers lured Admiral Halsey's forces north, drawing them away from the main fight. 4. The Battle off Samar, perhaps the most heroic stand of all, where a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers faced a vastly superior Japanese fleet and somehow, miraculously, held the line. And it all began with that first violent spark on October 21st. The ocean that burned. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship that morning, the salt wind stinging your eyes, the sound of engines rumbling below your feet. Suddenly, the horizon flashes. Plumes of black smoke rise where the sea once gleamed blue. The air fills with the roar of engines, the shriek of shells, and the deep, shaking thunder of explosions. For hours, the sea was alive with chaos. American bombers screamed down from the clouds, their payloads crashing into steel decks. Japanese torpedoes sliced through the waves, leaving foamy white trails of death. Battleships the size of city blocks fired their massive guns, their thunderclaps echoing across miles. The ocean itself seemed to burn. One survivor later wrote, "It wasn't a battle. It was a storm of fire and iron. The sea was boiling with men and metal." MacArthur's gamble. Even as the naval chaos unfolded offshore, MacArthur remained on Leyte, directing ground operations and giving speeches that inspired hope and defiance. He understood the stakes. If the Japanese succeeded in cutting off his supply lines, the entire invasion could collapse. But MacArthur's confidence never wavered. Standing before a group of drenched soldiers, he reportedly said, "We are here to stay until victory is won, and we shall not leave until the entire Philippines has been redeemed." His words became the emotional heartbeat of the campaign. Turning the tide. Despite the ferocity of Japan's counterattack, American technology, air power, and sheer resilience prevailed. The Japanese Navy lost nearly its entire remaining strength. 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and more than 10,000 men. The U.S. Navy lost several escort carriers and hundreds of brave sailors, but the beachhead at Leyte held firm. By the end of October, it was clear Japan's naval might was broken. Never again would it threaten Allied control of the Pacific. The human side of victory. But amid the statistics and strategies, it's easy to forget the human stories, the fear, the courage, the sacrifice. There were sailors who watched friends vanish into the waves, pilots who flew knowing they might never return, medics who worked in the glow of burning ships, trying to save lives while the sea around them burned orange. For every victory, there was heartbreak. For every act of valor, there was loss. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not just a turning point in war, it was a reminder of the cost of freedom. A legacy carved in salt and steel today, the wrecks of the Leyte Gulf battle lie silent beneath the sea, vast metal ghosts resting on the ocean floor. But their stories still echo. Divers who visit them describe a haunting calm, as if the ocean itself remembers the fury that once consumed it. For historians, the battle stands as a testament to strategy, technology, and bravery. For the people of the Philippines, it represents liberation, the beginning of the end of Japanese occupation, and the rebirth of their nation's freedom. And for the world, it remains proof that even in the darkest moments of war, human resolve can turn the tide. MacArthur's return, the world's turning point. When MacArthur returned to Manila months later, the Philippines was in ruins, but his promise had been fulfilled. The liberation was complete. The war in the Pacific would rage on until August 1945, but the tide had turned irrevocably at Leyte. In the grand sweep of history, October 21, 1944, was not just the day the Battle of Leyte Gulf began. It was the day empires collided and destiny was rewritten on the waters of the Pacific. The ocean burned, the sky thundered, and from that fire emerged a new world. Number 5. The birth of the iPod, 2001, the gadget that changed music forever. It's hard to believe now, but once upon a time, carrying your music meant juggling CDs, fumbling with cassette tapes, or loading a few dozen songs on a bulky MP3 player that barely fit in your pocket. Then, on October 23, 2001, a man in his trademark black turtleneck walked onto a small stage at Apple's headquarters and casually pulled a white rectangle from his jeans. "This," he said, "is the iPod. No fireworks, no screaming crowd, just quiet confidence, and an invention that would rewrite how humanity listened to music, moved through their days, and connected to sound." This is the story of how Apple's iPod didn't just store music, it liberated it. A world before the iPod. Before 2001, the music world was in chaos. The CD era was king, but it was clunky. You could only carry one album at a time, and portable players skipped if you jogged too fast or hit a bump on the bus. At the same time, the internet was beginning to reshape everything. File-sharing platforms like Napster had turned the industry upside down, letting users trade MP3 files for free, legally questionable but wildly popular. Millions were downloading songs, burning custom CDs, and personalizing playlists long before the music industry caught up. There was demand for a new way to own music, a format that fit the digital revolution's rhythm, but kept music in the listener's hands, not floating illegally online. That's when Apple, led by Steve Jobs, spotted a golden opportunity. Steve Jobs' vision: simplicity meets emotion. Apple in 2001 wasn't the tech titan we know today. The company had recently bounced back from near bankruptcy thanks to the iMac's success. Jobs had returned after a long exile and was determined to push Apple from a computer company into a lifestyle brand. His pitch to his engineers was simple: let ES make a music player that can hold your entire music library and fit right in your pocket. That single sentence became the DNA of the iPod. Jobs wasn't just after function, he wanted feeling. He wanted people to love using it, not tolerate it. The iPod wasn't going to be another gray plastic box with clunky buttons. It would be beautiful, intuitive, and personal. When he introduced it to the world, Jobs phrased it perfectly: 1,000 songs in your pocket. That line alone changed marketing forever. Engineering the impossible. Inside Apple's Cupertino lab, a small team was given a near-impossible task: build a portable music player that was small, light, fast, and capable of storing more songs than any device before it. The key was a 1.8-inch hard drive built by Toshiba, a marvel of its time. Apple's engineers paired it with a FireWire port, allowing songs to transfer from a Mac in seconds, a huge leap over USB speeds back then. They wrapped this technology in a minimalist design: a white body, clean edges, and that iconic click wheel. The click wheel wasn't just practical, it was almost philosophical. You could scroll through hundreds of songs with a single thumb, feeling each gentle tick as if your music had become tactile. John Rubinstein, Tony Fadell, and Johnny Ive were among the key players who turned Jobs' dream into reality. Fadell, an independent engineer at the time, had been working on a portable digital music concept. Apple brought him on board, and together, they built what would become the iPod prototype. Within just 8 months, the team went from idea to product launch. It was lightning speed, even by Apple's standards. October 23, 2001, the moment of unveiling. At Apple's Town Hall Theater, journalists and tech reviewers gathered, unsure what to expect. When Jobs unveiled the small white rectangle, weighing just 6.5 ounces, the crowd was skeptical. Many critics dismissed it as overpriced and redundant. It cost $399 and only worked with Mac computers, which limited its audience. Reviewers called it a niche toy for rich kids. But Jobs, as always, saw what they couldn't. He wasn't selling hardware, he was selling freedom. The freedom to choose your soundtrack anytime, anywhere, without skipping, swapping, or searching. Within months, early adopters were hooked. The combination of clean design, smooth performance, and emotional connection made the iPod a cultural magnet. The iTunes revolution. The iPod's true power didn't come from the device alone. It came from the ecosystem Apple built around it. In 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Store, offering a legal, affordable way to buy individual songs online for $0.99. It was a masterstroke. Overnight, Apple turned music piracy into music purchase and made it cool again. The iPod wasn't just a gadget, it was part of a lifestyle. Suddenly, your entire CD collection could live in your pocket. You could create playlists for every mood: study, heartbreak, road trip, gym, and carry them wherever you went. The white earphones became a fashion statement, a symbol that you were part of the digital frontier. The cultural shift. By the mid-2000s, the iPod had gone from curiosity to cultural icon. It wasn't just tech enthusiasts who loved it, it was everyone. From teens to travelers, from DJs to doctors. The iPod was personal. Apple's advertisements captured that emotion perfectly. Remember the silhouette ads? Black figures dancing against bright, colorful backgrounds with only the white iPod and earphones visible. They didn't show the product, they showed joy. The message was clear. The iPod isn't a T about technology. It's S about how music makes you feel. And that emotional storytelling changed how every company would market technology afterward. The iPod as a cultural milestone. The iPod didn't just reshape music, it reshaped Apple itself. It turned the company from a niche computer maker into a global brand that understood hearts, not just specs. The success of the iPod funded Apple's future innovations, leading directly to the iPhone, which combined the iPod's music library with calling, apps, and touch controls. In that sense, the iPod wasn't just a device, it was the foundation of modern mobile culture. Without it, there would be no iPhone, no App Store, no Spotify, no Apple Music as we know them. Competitors and evolution. The market soon filled with challengers. Microsoft's Zune, Creative Zen, and countless cheaper MP3 players. But none could match Apple's design or emotional connection. The ecosystem, iPod plus iTunes, was airtight. Once you entered it, you rarely left. Apple kept innovating. iPod Mini, 2004, smaller, colorful, more accessible. iPod Nano, 2005, wafer-thin, futuristic. iPod Shuffle, no screen, pure simplicity for those who wanted surprise. iPod Touch, 2007. The bridge between iPod and iPhone. Each evolution kept one principle alive. Music should be easy, beautiful, and yours. The slow fade and lasting legacy. By the 2010s, streaming had taken over. Services like Spotify and Apple Music made downloading songs obsolete. The iPod, once the king of personal music, began to fade quietly into nostalgia. In May 2022, Apple officially discontinued the last iPod model, the iPod Touch. But rather than mourning, people around the world shared memories. Their first playlist, their first pair of white earphones, their first late-night walk with the world tuned out and music filling the silence. Because that's what the iPod really did. It made music private. It made it intimate. It gave every listener their own world. 1,000 songs, infinite moments. When Jobs said, 1,000 songs in your pocket, he wasn't exaggerating. He was prophesying. The iPod changed how we thought about ownership, portability, and identity. Music stopped being tied to a place or a format. It became part of us, something we could carry, curate, and define ourselves by. Every generation has a moment when technology shifts culture. The iPod was one of those moments. It turned passive listening into personal storytelling. It made silence optional. Soft acoustic guitar fades in, a nostalgic tune reminiscent of the early iTunes ads. So the next time you pull out your phone, scroll through your streaming app, and hit play, remember. It all began with a small white rectangle unveiled in 2001. A pocket full of songs, a revolution in your hand, and a new way to feel the world through sound. Number 6. First woman in spacewalk, Svetlana Savitskaya, 1982. On July 25, 1984, far above the blue curve of Earth, a woman in a bulky white suit drifted into the silent vacuum of space. Her name was Svetlana Savitskaya, and with a steady breath and a tether clipped to her craft, she made history as the first woman ever to walk in space. But this isn't just a tale about floating among the stars. It's about the courage to step beyond the boundary of human fear, and the quiet, relentless determination of a woman who defied both gravity and gender expectations in an era when few believed she could. The world before her spacewalk. It was the early 1980s. The Cold War was still burning, and the space race, though calmer than in the 1960s, was far from over. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer racing just to reach space. They were competing to master it. The Soviet Union, long proud of its early space firsts, the first satellite, Sputnik, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, and the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, wanted to prove it still led humanity's charge into the cosmos. And so, a new mission took shape. A female cosmonaut, not just flying, but working in open space, performing tasks that even most men had yet to attempt. That woman was Svetlana Savitskaya, test pilot, engineer, and a symbol of unflinching resolve. Who was Svetlana Savitskaya? Born in Moscow in 1948, Svetlana seemed destined to fly. Her father, Yevgeny Savitsky, was a decorated Soviet air marshal and war hero. But Svetlana wasn't content to live in her father's shadow. From an early age, she wanted to earn her own wings, literally. By her teens, she had already begun parachuting, logging hundreds of jumps. She graduated from the Moscow Aviation Institute, trained as a test pilot, and became known for her fearlessness in the cockpit. Colleagues described her as disciplined, calm, and sharp under pressure, the traits that make great aviators and even rarer cosmonauts. But for a woman in the 1970s Soviet Union, even with her qualifications, the road to space was steep. Space exploration had long been dominated by men, both in training and in representation. Yet Savitskaya, with her grit and technical mastery, slowly began to make the impossible look inevitable. The first flight, Salyut 7, 1982. Savitskaya's first mission came in 1982 aboard Soyuz T-7, alongside Leonid Popov and Alexander Serebrov. When she launched into orbit, she became only the second woman in history to fly in space, nearly 2 decades after Valentina Tereshkova's solo flight in 1963. Imagine that. 20 years between the first and second woman in space. Her flight to the Salyut 7 space station lasted 7 days, during which she conducted scientific experiments and demonstrated that women could perform equally well in microgravity. Her calm demeanor and professionalism impressed the Soviet space program deeply. But Savitskaya wasn't done. She wasn't interested in being remembered as the second woman. She wanted to be remembered as the first person to take the next step. And 2 years later, she did. 1984, preparing for the spacewalk. By 1984, Savitskaya had been chosen for a second mission, Soyuz T-12, this time with a groundbreaking agenda. A spacewalk, or EVA, extravehicular activity, something no woman had ever done. She trained rigorously, undergoing months of endurance tests, pressure suit drills, and mock spacewalks underwater. Her EVA was not symbolic. It was a working mission. She and cosmonaut Vladimir Janibekov were to weld, cut, and manipulate metal plates, testing tools for potential construction in space. To many Western observers, the timing was no coincidence. The US had just sent its first female astronaut, Sally Reed, to space the year before. The Soviets wanted to remind the world that they were still capable of firsts. But to Savitskaya, this wasn't about politics. It was about proving capability, hers and humanity's. The moment, July 25, 1984. Sound. Gentle air pressure hiss, muffled breathing inside a helmet, the heartbeat of space, slow, constant, echoing. As the hatch of Salyut 7 opened, the blackness of space greeted her like an ocean with no surface. Savitskaya carefully stepped out, tethered to the spacecraft by a lifeline that shimmered against the Earth's reflection. She spent 3 hours and 35 minutes outside the station, a feat of precision and endurance. Together with Janibekov, she cut and welded metals using special tools, testing how materials behaved in microgravity. Inside her helmet, she was calm, focused. Every movement mattered. Every breath, every communication, every flick of the wrist echoed across the vacuum. And as she worked, the Earth rolled silently beneath her, blues, greens, and clouds swirling in slow motion. At that moment, Svetlana Savitskaya wasn't just a Soviet cosmonaut. She was a pioneer, for women, for science, and for the idea that courage knows no gender. Breaking barriers, quietly but completely. When Savitskaya returned to Earth, she had not only proven her personal strength, but had changed the narrative of spaceflight. Her mission demonstrated that women could perform complex, physically demanding spacewalks with the same precision as their male counterparts, perhaps even more calmly under pressure. NASA itself later acknowledged that her achievement had inspired a generation of female astronauts who followed, from Catherine Sullivan, the first American woman to walk in space later that same year, to Peggy Whitson, Sunita Williams, and Christina Koch, who would set future records for endurance and all-female spacewalks. Legacy beyond the headlines. Savitskaya's achievements were monumental, yet often understated. She received 2 Hero of the Soviet Union awards, the country's highest honor. But outside Russia, her story was sometimes overshadowed by the flashier narratives of male cosmonauts and Western astronauts. Still, her quiet determination left a mark that endures. Even today, when female astronauts perform EVAs from the International Space Station, they follow a trail that Savitskaya carved, one steady movement at a time, in the cold silence of the stars. In interviews years later, she spoke modestly of her achievement, saying, "When you are in space, you don't think of yourself as a woman or a man. You think as a human doing a job." That simple statement captured the essence of her mission, not about proving superiority, but equality, a reflection on the human spirit, soft orchestral swell, strings mixed with the faint hum of radio static, as if from space transmissions. Svetlana Savitskaya's story is more than a historical first. It is a reminder that every leap for humankind begins with one person willing to take a literal step into the unknown. Her courage wasn't loud, it was disciplined. Her ambition wasn't boastful, it was focused. She didn't chase fame, she pursued excellence. In a world that still debates the limits of gender, her example reminds us that limits are human-made and can be human unmade. Her name might not appear in pop culture montages or fashion headlines, but her imprint is etched on the very frontier of human exploration. Every spacewalk, every satellite repair, every cosmic photograph owes something to the woman who walked outside her spacecraft and redefined what humanity could look like among the stars. The long view, from Savitskaya to the stars ahead. Today, as space agencies and private companies plan missions to Mars, the Moon, and beyond, the influence of Savitskaya's EVA continues. Her work with on-orbit construction and welding helped shape the foundation for future space station assembly and in-space manufacturing concepts. The International Space Station, and the generations of astronauts who have called it home, stand partly on her shoulders. And as women from around the world now train for lunar landings under NASA's Artemis program, they are not just following in her footsteps, they are continuing her walk. She floated where few had dared, wielding tools in the void of space, calm, capable, unflinching. Svetlana Savitskaya, the first woman to walk among the stars, showed us that exploration belongs to everyone, and that even in the silence of space, one voice, one step, can echo through history. Number 7. Ernest Hemingway publishes The Old Man and the Sea, 1952, October 21st, 1952. A quiet morning in Cuba. The sea shimmered like molten silver under the rising sun. Ernest Hemingway sat on the porch of his Finca Vigia home, a cat by his feet, a glass of rum by his typewriter. The world had nearly forgotten him. Once the golden boy of American literature, Hemingway was now considered washed up. Critics said his best days were behind him, that the man who wrote A Farewell to Arms and for whom the bell tolls had nothing left to say. But that morning, with the clatter of typewriter keys echoing through the humid Cuban air, Hemingway began his quiet redemption. He wasn't writing for fame, nor for critics. He was writing for himself, and for the sea. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream. With those words, Hemingway began a story that would soon capture the world's heart, The Old Man and the Sea. It was the tale of Santiago, an aging fisherman, poor and unlucky, who hadn't caught a fish in 84 days. Villagers whispered he was cursed. The young boy who once fished with him had been sent away by his parents. But Santiago, stubborn, proud, and hopeful, refused to surrender. Each morning, he rowed into the open sea alone, chasing not just fish, but purpose. Hemingway poured himself into Santiago, line by line, wave by wave. The story wasn't fiction, it was reflection. The old man's battle with the marlin mirrored Hemingway's own struggle with time, critics, and self-doubt. By the early 1950s, Hemingway's health was failing. The heavy drinking, the plane crashes in Africa, the endless chase of adventure, it had all taken its toll. His last novel, Across the River and Into the Trees, had been torn apart by reviewers. They called it sentimental, self-indulgent, a failure. For Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea was more than a story. It was atonement. He wrote it in just 8 weeks. Simple words, no frills. No grand war scenes or sprawling romances, only a man, a fish, and the sea. Yet within that simplicity lay extraordinary depth. Hemingway once said, "All a writer has to do is write one true sentence." And in The Old Man and the Sea, every sentence feels true. The sea, vast and indifferent. The marlin, noble and magnificent. The old man, fragile yet unbreakable. It wasn't about catching the fish, it was about proving that even in defeat, there is dignity. Santiago hooks the great marlin, and for 3 days and 3 nights, he battles the creature in silence. His hands bleed, his back aches, his body weakens, but his spirit does not. The marlin, just like the sea, becomes both an enemy and a companion. Hemingway transforms this struggle into poetry, the eternal dance between man and nature, ambition and humility, triumph and loss. When Santiago finally kills the marlin, he ties it to his boat, proud but exhausted. Yet sharks soon attack, tearing the fish apart, leaving behind only bones. It's heartbreaking, but it's also beautiful, because Santiago returns to shore, beaten, yes, but not broken. He's proven that the measure of a man isn't in his victory, but in how he fights his battles. When Hemingway sent The Old Man and the Sea to his publisher, Charles Scribner's Sons, the editors were stunned. It was short, barely 27,000 words, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. When the story was published in Life magazine on September 1, 1952, it sold over 5 million copies in just 48 hours. Newspapers called it a literary resurrection. The world that had turned its back on Hemingway suddenly remembered why they had once adored him. Letters poured in from readers around the world, sailors, students, soldiers, widows, all seeing themselves in Santiago's quiet courage. In 1953, Hemingway received the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for The Old Man and the Sea. The following year, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. But even then, he wasn't boastful. In his Nobel acceptance speech, Hemingway said softly, "A writer should write what he has to say, not speak it." That humility, that stripped-down honesty, mirrored Santiago's own spirit, a man who, even after losing everything, finds grace in persistence. Behind the success, though, lay a shadow. Hemingway was never the same again. The Old Man and the Sea became his final great work. He moved through the years that followed like a ghost haunted by his own creation. The depression deepened, the drinking worsened. The man who once hunted lions in Africa now struggled to face his own mind. Yet even in his darkest days, people remembered Santiago. Teachers read the book to children, soldiers carried it in their backpacks, artists painted its imagery on their studio walls. Because The Old Man and the Sea wasn't just a story about a fisherman, it was a story about all of us. About every person who's ever fought a losing battle and kept fighting anyway. The novella became a mirror of life itself, filled with struggle, fleeting victories, and quiet endurance. Hemingway's writing style, often called the iceberg theory, showed only what was necessary, letting deeper emotions hide beneath the surface. Like the sea that Santiago sailed, the real meaning lay beneath the waves. Every reader saw something different in it: faith, resilience, loneliness, or redemption. That's the beauty of Hemingway's genius. His simplicity concealed infinite depth. At his home in Cuba, Hemingway often sat beneath the shade of mango trees, rereading his manuscript. Friends remembered him smiling quietly, sometimes whispering lines to himself. He once told a friend, "This story is as true as I can write it." And perhaps that's why it endures. Because truth, simple, raw, and painfully human, never goes out of style. Today, The Old Man and the Sea is taught in schools across the world, translated into more than 50 languages, adapted into films, plays, and even operas. Its message remains timeless. A man can be destroyed but not defeated. That single line has become a mantra for generations, for soldiers returning home, for dreamers facing failure, for anyone standing against the tide of life. In the end, Hemingway and Santiago became one. Two men, one real, one imagined, bound by the same truth. That courage isn't loud, it's quiet, patient, and relentless. When we read The Old Man and the Sea, we don't just meet an old fisherman. We meet the part of ourselves that refuses to give up, even when the world has already written us off. So the next time you feel you've reached your last ounce of strength, remember Santiago. Remember Hemingway. Remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from enduring. On October 21st, 1952, Ernest Hemingway didn't just publish a story. He redefined what it means to be human. Number 8, Birth of Alfred Nobel, 1833, The Paradox of Peace and Power. October 21st, 1833, Stockholm, Sweden. The city woke to a morning wrapped in mist, the streets still damp from last night's rain. In a modest wooden house near the Norrstrom River, a fragile baby took his first breath. Alfred Bernhard Nobel. No one knew that this tiny child, born into a family of struggling inventors, would one day create something that could move mountains or destroy them. Alfred was the son of Admiral Nobel, a dreamer, engineer, and restless mind. His father's workshop was filled with smoke, gears, and the smell of gunpowder. Life was never stable. The family faced bankruptcy more than once. But what the Nobels lacked in comfort, they made up for in curiosity. Emmanuel taught his sons how to read blueprints before bedtime stories, how to question everything, and how to see science not as danger, but as potential. Alfred absorbed it all. By the time he was a teenager, he could speak 5 languages: Swedish, Russian, French, English, and German. And by 17, he was already a chemist, fascinated by one of the most volatile elements known to man, nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin, the unpredictable liquid that could blow apart mountains or take lives in an instant. In the mid-19th century, construction and mining were booming across Europe, but workers risked everything using crude explosives. Alfred saw a problem and a possibility. He believed science could tame destruction, that with precision, danger could become progress, and so began his obsession to make nitroglycerin safe. He experimented tirelessly, often in makeshift labs. He watched chemicals mix, explode, fail, then started again. Failure didn't scare him, it fascinated him. But one day in 1864, in a quiet laboratory near Stockholm, tragedy struck. A massive explosion tore through the building. Among the victims was Alfred's younger brother, Emil Nobel. The blast shattered not only the lab, but Alfred's heart. Most people would have stopped then, given up, walked away from a science that had already taken too much. But Alfred didn't. He rebuilt the lab, moved operations to a barge on Lake Mälaren, safer from accidents, and went back to work. For years he experimented, tested, refined, until finally, in 1867, he discovered the formula that changed everything. By combining nitroglycerin with a soft, absorbent clay called kieselguhr, he created a stable, moldable substance, powerful yet manageable. He called it dynamite. The world gasped. With dynamite, tunnels could pierce mountains. Railways could connect nations. Cities could rise where stone once stood. Alfred Nobel was hailed as a genius. His invention promised progress, and he patented it in over 90 countries. Factories bearing his name sprang up across Europe. His fortune grew. His reputation soared. He was no longer the poor inventor's son. He was one of the richest men in the world. But there was a shadow behind the brilliance. Dynamite, meant for creation, was soon used for destruction. Armies weaponized it. Wars grew deadlier. And with every explosion on a battlefield, Alfred Nobel's name was whispered in blame. He began to withdraw from public life, haunted by what he had unleashed. One morning in 1888, Alfred woke to a shocking sight, his own obituary. A French newspaper had mistaken Alfred for his deceased brother Ludwig and published a headline that read, "The Merchant of Death is dead." The article continued, "Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday." Alfred sat in silence, reading his life as the world saw it, not as an inventor, but as a destroyer. It was his awakening. In that chilling moment, Alfred Nobel made a vow. He would not be remembered for death, but for life. He began drafting his will, a plan that would shock his family and the world. When he died, almost all of his immense fortune, nearly 94%, would be used to create a fund for the Nobel Prizes. These prizes would honor those who brought the greatest benefit to humankind in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. Later, economics would be added, but it was that word peace that carried the heaviest weight. When his will was made public after his death in 1896, it stunned Europe. His relatives were outraged. They had expected riches, not philanthropy, but Nobel's vision went beyond bloodlines. He believed legacy wasn't what you leave to people, but what you leave for them. In 1901, 5 years after his death, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded. Among the earliest laureates were the greatest minds of their age: Wilhelm Röntgen, discoverer of X-rays; Henri Dunant, founder of the Red Cross; and Sully Prudhomme, the French poet whose verses celebrated humanity. From that day forward, Alfred Nobel's name was reborn. Over the decades, the Nobel Prize became more than an award. It became the world's conscience. It honored Marie Curie for her discoveries that saved lives, Martin Luther King Jr. for his nonviolent fight for equality, Nelson Mandela for his courage to forgive, Malala Yousafzai for her voice in education. Every medal, every ceremony, every speech whispered the same truth: that peace, progress, and humanity are worth more than power or wealth. Still, Nobel's legacy remains a paradox. The man who invented dynamite, an agent of destruction, also created one of the greatest symbols of peace. He once wrote, "If I have 1,000 ideas and only one turns out to be good, I am satisfied." And that one good idea, to turn fortune into peace, continues to shape history. Today, Alfred Nobel's final resting place lies in Stockholm's Norra Begravningsplatsen cemetery. On his simple gravestone, there are no explosions, no formulas, no boasts of brilliance, only a name that echoes through time. Each December, the world gathers in Stockholm and Oslo to celebrate those who have followed his mission: scientists, writers, peacekeepers, dreamers. The ceremony is grand, but its spirit remains humble, just as Nobel wished. Alfred Nobel's story reminds us that human genius walks a delicate line between creation and destruction, between ambition and morality. He didn't change the world with his invention alone, but with his redemption. He turned the echo of explosions into a symphony of peace. And though he was born into struggle, he left behind a world that still believes that knowledge, compassion, and courage can coexist. Born on October 21, 1833, Alfred Nobel proved one timeless truth: even in the hands of those who create destruction, the power to build peace still exists. Number 9. Battle of the Solent Anniversary, 1545, the day the Mary Rose sank. The year is 1545. England stands on the edge of war. The sky over the Solent, that narrow strip of water separating the Isle of Wight from the English mainland, hangs thick with mist and tension. Below, the waves glisten under the dull light of a July morning. And at the heart of this scene sails one of the most famous ships in English history, the Mary Rose. For King Henry VIII, this was more than a battle. It was personal. The Battle of the Solent, fought between England and France, was not the largest naval conflict of the age, but it became one of its most haunting, because on that day, the pride of England's navy vanished beneath the waves. To understand that day, we must step back in time, to the heart of the Tudor age. England was transforming. King Henry VIII had broken away from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and reshaped his nation's identity. But rebellion and rivalry brewed on the continent. France, once an uneasy ally, had turned bitter enemy. By 1545, King Francis I of France launched a massive invasion fleet. Over 200 ships, determined to crush the English navy and strike at the very heart of Henry's rule. Henry's answer? His own navy, smaller but fierce, trained and loyal. Among them, the Mary Rose stood as the jewel of his fleet. Launched in 1511, the Mary Rose was the flagship of the Tudor Navy, a technological marvel of her time. She was fast, heavily armed, and beautifully built, her hull strong, her decks lined with rows of bronze cannons. She was named, it is believed, after Henry's sister Mary and the Tudor Rose, symbolizing purity and power. For more than 30 years, she served in wars against France and Scotland, becoming a floating symbol of English pride. But that pride would soon meet its fate. It was July 19, 1545, a bright morning over the Solent. The English fleet waited near Portsmouth, bracing for the French attack. On the horizon, hundreds of enemy sails appeared like a forest of ghosts. The wind carried the scent of salt and gunpowder. Henry VIII himself stood on the ramparts of Southsea Castle, watching his navy prepare for battle. The Mary Rose, under the command of Sir George Carew, led the charge. The sea roared with explosions, cannons fired, smoke billowed, and the clash of war filled the air. The English held their line, proud, defiant. And then, in a moment no one saw coming, tragedy struck. As the Mary Rose turned to fire another broadside, a sudden gust of wind filled her sails. The ship heeled sharply to one side. Water rushed through her open gun ports. In seconds, the pride of England began to sink. Sailors screamed as the ship listed violently. Barrels, cannons, and men slid across the deck, tumbling into the sea. Witnesses on shore could do nothing but watch in horror. Within minutes, the Mary Rose disappeared beneath the waves, taking with her over 400 souls. Only a few dozen men survived. From his vantage point at Southsea Castle, Henry VIII reportedly stood frozen, watching helplessly as his beloved ship, his pride, vanished before his eyes. The cause of her sinking became a mystery that would last for centuries. Some blamed a sudden shift of wind, others whispered of a French cannon shot. Many suspected the ship was simply overloaded, her lower gun ports left open in the heat of battle. Whatever the reason, one truth remained. England's mightiest warship had sunk in calm waters, mere moments after firing her guns. The sea had swallowed not only the Mary Rose, but a generation of English sailors, men, boys, gunners, carpenters, and even musicians who once played on her decks. For centuries, the Mary Rose slept beneath the Solent's silt, a time capsule of Tudor life, untouched and forgotten. But she was not lost forever. In 1971, a diver named Alexander McKee began searching for her remains. His team, using sonar and archaeology, discovered something extraordinary: preserved wooden timbers deep in the seabed. It was the Mary Rose, resting where she had fallen more than 400 years before. For the next decade, divers worked carefully, inch by inch, uncovering history buried by the tides. And then, on October 11, 1982, in one of the most breathtaking archaeological events ever broadcast, the Mary Rose rose again. Before millions of television viewers, a giant yellow lifting frame slowly raised her remains from the water. As her timbers broke the surface, people wept. Historians, sailors, citizens, even those who knew little of her story. Because in that moment, England's lost ship had come home. Inside her hull lay over 19,000 artifacts: shoes, weapons, spoons, tools, musical instruments, even the skeleton of a ship's dog. Each relic whispered the same message. This wasn't just a warship, it was a world, a floating city, frozen in time, capturing the daily life of Tudor sailors with astonishing detail. The Mary Rose became more than an archaeological treasure. She became a mirror, reflecting England's past, its innovation, and its fragility. Her rediscovery changed how we understood Tudor history. We learned how sailors ate, how they slept, even how they fought tooth decay. Every discovery breathing life into a long, silent age. Today, her remains rest in a custom-built museum in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, displayed with reverence. Visitors walk through a dimly lit hall where the preserved hull glows softly behind glass. The air hums with the quiet respect of those meeting ghosts. The Battle of the Solent may have faded from textbooks, overshadowed by grander wars and greater fleets, but to those who know, it represents something more profound, a turning point in Britain's naval heritage, because in the Mary Rose's loss, England learned. She inspired new designs, better stability, and more advanced naval engineering. The tragedy beneath the waves helped shape the navy that would one day rule the seas. It is easy to see the Mary Rose as a story of failure, a ship that sank on a calm day, taking hundreds of lives with her. But that would be too simple. Her story is not about loss, it's about endurance, about how even in ruin, legacy survives, how the sea, though it claims, also preserves, and how one ship, long forgotten beneath layers of mud and memory, could still rise again, reminding us who we were and what we dared to build. When you stand before the Mary Rose today, when you look upon the ship that served a king and slept beneath the sea, you feel something rare. Not just awe, but connection. You hear the echo of cannons, the laughter of sailors, the creak of ropes. You feel history breathing again. And you realize, sometimes the greatest stories don't belong to the victors or the survivors, but to those who sank trying to serve something greater than themselves. The Mary Rose never returned to port, but her spirit and the story of the Battle of the Solent still sails on the tides of time. Number 10. First photo of Earth from space published, 1946. The year was 1946. The world was still reeling from the devastation of the Second World War. Nations were rebuilding, cities were healing, and humanity was learning to dream again. This time, not of conquest, but of possibility. Amid the rubble and recovery, a handful of American scientists and engineers were already looking up, toward the skies, believing the next great chapter of human discovery wouldn't be written on land or sea, but beyond the clouds. And on October 24, 1946, inside a military testing range in New Mexico, the impossible quietly happened. For the first time in human history, a camera, a small black and white motion picture camera, captured Earth from space. It was a moment that no one truly understood at the time, but it marked the beginning of a new age, the space age. A world in transition. In the aftermath of Weitu, scientific ambition had taken an unexpected turn. Rocket technology, initially developed for war, was now being repurposed for research and exploration. The V-2 rocket, designed by Nazi engineers to rain destruction on London and Antwerp, was now in the hands of the United States Army and a group of pioneering scientists. Among them were engineers from White Sands Missile Range, who began using these rockets for experiments in atmospheric science. Their goal wasn't fame or spectacle, it was curiosity. They wanted to understand Earth's atmosphere, its temperature, radiation levels, and composition at high altitudes. But they also had a simple idea. What if we could see what Earth looks like from above? The rocket that looked back. The mission was called V-2 number 13, just another test flight on paper. The rocket itself was a towering metal spear, nearly 47 feet tall, capable of reaching speeds over 3,500 miles per hour. Inside, mounted inside the nose cone, was a 35mm motion picture camera made by DeVry. It was rigged to automatically take one photograph every second and a half during the flight. At precisely 8:00 a.m., the rocket launched from White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Flames burst from its base as it tore through the sky, leaving behind a plume of smoke that twisted like a comet's tail. It climbed to an altitude of 65 miles, above the Kármán line, the invisible boundary that marks the edge of space. And as it rose, it turned its lens not toward the stars, but back toward us. The moment that changed everything. The camera clicked and whirred as the rocket soared higher and higher. The frames it captured showed something no human had ever seen: a curved horizon, the thin blue line of our atmosphere, and the swirling patterns of clouds over the southwestern United States. When the film canister was recovered, miraculously intact, the scientists gathered in a dimly lit room to develop the images. As the negatives appeared in the chemical bath, A hush fell over the lab. For the first time, humans could see their home planet from the edge of space. The images were grainy, monochrome, and blurred at the edges, yet hauntingly beautiful. They revealed the Earth as a sphere, fragile, luminous, floating in the endless blackness of the cosmos. That single reel of film contained the first true portrait of our planet, more than just a picture. It's hard today to grasp how profound that moment was. In 1946, no one had ever left the atmosphere. The space race hadn't yet begun. Satellites were still science fiction. To see Earth from that altitude, to see its curvature, was to experience something deeply humbling. Before that photograph, humanity's understanding of the world was limited to maps, globes, and imagination. But this picture proved it. We live on a finite, round, delicate planet surrounded by nothingness. It was a scientific revelation and a spiritual awakening. From rockets to perspective. That single photo didn't just change how scientists studied the atmosphere. It changed how humanity saw itself. In the decades that followed, images from space would become a central part of our collective consciousness. Think about it. From the blue marble photo taken by Apollo 17 astronauts in 1972, to the mesmerizing satellite images that define modern meteorology and climate science, they all trace their lineage back to that first experiment in 1946. This was the moment the world learned to look at itself from above, and perhaps to realize that the boundaries we draw, the nations, the wars, the differences, are invisible from space. From that height, there are no borders, no divisions, just one shimmering blue planet. The irony of war giving birth to wonder. The story of that first photo carries an ironic weight. The rocket that captured Earth's image, the V2, was a weapon of war, responsible for thousands of deaths during the Second World War. Yet, in a poetic twist of history, it became the vehicle that gifted humanity its first cosmic mirror. The same technology that once symbolized destruction was now being used for discovery. It's a striking reminder of how human ingenuity, even when born from conflict, can evolve into something noble, something that unites rather than divides. Seeds of the space age. That first image of Earth from space was like a whisper of the future. Within a decade, the Soviet Union would launch Sputnik. The US would send Explorer 1, and a global race to explore space would begin in earnest. But long before those milestones, that 1946 photograph inspired scientists, dreamers, and ordinary people alike. It made space feel possible, reachable. It transformed the idea of space travel from fantasy to foreseeable reality. It's no exaggeration to say that without this moment, the Apollo missions, the Hubble telescope, and the International Space Station might have remained dreams deferred, a new kind of human story. Every once in a while, humanity does something that redefines its own story. Fire, the wheel, flight, and then this, seeing Earth from beyond Earth. In that moment, without even knowing it, humanity had crossed a threshold. The sky was no longer the limit. The picture said, you can go further, you can rise higher, you can see more. It wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a philosophical awakening. That photograph hinted at fragility, at unity, at the sheer wonder of existence. It inspired generations of astronauts, scientists, and environmentalists. Even Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, decades later, echoed the sentiment first born in 1946, that seeing Earth from space changes everything. The legacy of that one frame. Today, that first image is preserved in archives, often overshadowed by later, more colorful photographs of our planet, but its significance remains unmatched. It was the first time humanity saw its home not as a map, not as an idea, but as a real, living world. And from that one picture, a cascade of progress followed. Space weather studies, satellite imaging, global communication systems, and even environmental awareness movements. Because once you see the Earth as one fragile orb surrounded by infinite darkness, it is impossible to look away the same way again. Epilogue: the humble beginning of cosmic vision. The rocket that took that picture crashed moments later, its metal body shattered across the desert, but its legacy soared. The fragments of that V2 may have been buried under sand, but the vision it carried, that of humanity looking back at itself, continues to echo across history. So when we gaze today at high-definition images of Earth taken from the James Webb Space Telescope or watch astronauts float above our world in the International Space Station, it all connects back to that single, grainy black and white frame from October 1946. That moment, when a war-born rocket and a simple film camera gave us the most profound photograph ever taken, the first photo of Earth from space. It wasn't just the beginning of space photography, it was the beginning of perspective. Number 11, Birth of Carrie Fisher, 1956. The year was 1956, and Hollywood was golden, a time when studios ruled the screen, glamour reigned supreme, and the silver screen felt like a dream you could touch. Amid the flashing lights, red carpets, and the scent of old Hollywood allure, a child was born who would one day shine brighter than most of its stars. Her name, Carrie Frances Fisher. No one could have guessed then that this little girl, born to two of Hollywood's most famous figures, Debbie Reynolds, the effervescent star of Singin' in the Rain, and Eddie Fisher, the crooning pop idol, would one day become one of cinema's most beloved icons. But as fate would have it, Carrie Fisher wasn't just born into fame. She was destined to reshape what fame, vulnerability, and resilience looked like in a world that often confused spotlight with strength. A star born into stardom, growing up in the limelight sounds like a dream, but for Carrie, it was a complicated one. Her childhood was dazzling yet chaotic, filled with Hollywood premieres, glittering galas, and the flashing cameras that never truly turned off. When she was just 2 years old, her parents' very public marriage ended in scandal after Eddie Fisher left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor. The tabloids feasted on the drama, and Carrie learned early that fame came with a price. But from a young age, she also showed remarkable wit and curiosity, a mind sharper than most adults around her. Books became her escape, and poetry her secret refuge. Before she ever stood in front of a camera, Carrie was already writing, already observing the world with a sense of irony and compassion that would later define her voice. The galaxy far, far away. Fast forward to 1977, a film was about to change cinema forever. A young director named George Lucas had cast an unknown 19-year-old actress in a space adventure few believed would succeed. The role? Princess Leia Organa, leader of the Rebel Alliance. The film was Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, and the rest is history. When audiences first saw her, that white gown, the cinnamon bun hair, the defiant glare, Leia wasn't just another princess. She was a revelation, a royal who didn't need rescuing, a leader who commanded armies, fired blasters, and stood toe-to-toe with smugglers and Sith lords alike. Carrie Fisher gave Leia her courage, her sarcasm, her edge, and unknowingly gave generations of women a symbol of empowerment. In an era when most female characters existed in the background, Leia was front and center, and Carrie, with her quick wit and fiery charm, made her unforgettable. The line, "Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?" wasn't just Leia talking, it was pure Carrie, sharp, funny, and utterly fearless. Fame, pressure, and the human behind the hero with Star Wars came global fame, the kind few ever experience. Carrie Fisher became a household name overnight. Her image was everywhere. Posters, toys, magazines, interviews. Yet behind that legendary smile, she struggled with something far deeper. Carrie faced mental health challenges that the world rarely talked about then, bipolar disorder and addiction. The pressures of fame, combined with her genetic legacy and public scrutiny, made her battles brutally difficult. But what makes Carrie Fisher truly remarkable isn't that she suffered, it is that she fought and then spoke. Years later, she would become one of the first celebrities to publicly discuss mental illness and addiction without shame. She transformed her pain into art, humor, and advocacy, giving a voice to millions who felt voiceless. The writer behind the icon. Many remember Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, but she was also a brilliant writer, one of Hollywood's sharpest pens. Her semi-autobiographical novel Postcards from the Edge, 1987, became a bestseller and later a film starring Meryl Streep. The story, inspired by her complex relationship with her mother and her recovery from addiction, was equal parts painful and hilarious, a perfect reflection of Fisher herself. Her writing wasn't just confessional, it was cutting. She dissected Hollywood's absurdity, fame's fragility, and the hypocrisies of celebrity culture with biting wit. Whether through novels, screenplays, or interviews, Carrie used humor as both a weapon and a shield. As she once quipped, "If my life weren't funny, it would just be true," and that's unacceptable. That single sentence captures her brilliance, self-aware, raw, and real. A cultural symbol beyond cinema. Carrie Fisher's influence stretched far beyond the Star Wars saga. Leia became a feminist icon, a sci-fi legend, and a cultural touchstone. When The Force Awakens premiered in 2015, decades after her first appearance, fans wept to see her return. Older, wiser, still fierce. But Carrie herself often poked fun at her legacy. She refused to be romanticized or airbrushed. She spoke openly about aging, weight, Hollywood double standards, and did it with such unapologetic humor that she became even more beloved. When critics commented on how she had aged since the original trilogy, she fired back. "Youth and beauty are not accomplishments. They're the temporary happy byproducts of time and DNA." That's Carrie, fearless, funny, unfiltered, a mother, an advocate, a warrior. Beyond the fame, the conventions, and the interviews, there was Carrie the mother, fiercely protective, deeply loving, and often hilariously honest. Her daughter, Billie Lourd, would later follow in her footsteps as an actress, carrying forward her mother's wit and resilience. Carrie Fisher's advocacy for mental health made her a different kind of hero. She spoke at universities, wrote essays, and gave countless interviews challenging stigma. She reminded the world that you could be broken and brilliant at the same time, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was courage. The final chapter and eternal legacy. On December 27, 2016, the world fell silent. Carrie Fisher passed away at the age of 60 after suffering a cardiac arrest on a flight from London to Los Angeles. The news spread like wildfire. Disbelief, heartbreak, and an outpouring of love from fans around the world. A day later, in a twist almost too poetic for reality, her mother Debbie Reynolds passed away as well. Reynolds' last words were reportedly, "I want to be with Carrie," a mother and daughter, icons of two generations, reunited in eternity. But death couldn't dim Carrie Fisher's light. Her laughter, her honesty, her iconic buns, all remain etched in the world's collective memory. Leia became a symbol of rebellion, of hope, of resilience. And Carrie Fisher, the woman behind her, became something even greater. A symbol of authenticity in a world obsessed with illusion. The woman who made space human, Carrie Fisher, once said, "Take your broken heart, make it into art." And she did. Every piece of her story, from Hollywood royalty to rebellion, from addiction to advocacy, became a testament to transformation. Her journey wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. She showed that strength doesn't mean being unbreakable. It means showing up anyway, with all your cracks, and daring to laugh. When you watch her as Leia today, standing against the Empire, blaster in hand, chin held high, it's impossible not to see Carrie Fisher, the woman who fought her own wars and won hearts across galaxies. A star that never burned out. Carrie Fisher didn't just play a hero in the stars. She was one. Her words still inspire countless people battling their own demons. Her face still lights up screens, convention halls, and fan art across the world. She continues to be celebrated not just as a performer, but as a truth teller, a fighter, and a force. Because the real magic of Carrie Fisher is that she didn't just leave behind a character. She left behind a legacy. A legacy of laughter, courage, and defiance. The kind that whispers to every dreamer who's ever felt lost, "You can be your own kind of rebel." In the grand tapestry of history, October 21st will forever hold a special shimmer. Not because a princess was born, but because a truth teller was. Carrie Fisher, the woman who taught the world that rebellion can be beautiful, that honesty can heal, and that even galaxies far, far away need a little humor. She didn't just belong to Star Wars, she belonged to the stars themselves. Number 12. The record-setting flight by Franz Reichelt from the Eiffel Tower, 1911. It was a cold winter morning in Paris, February 4th, 1912, though history often remembers it as a timeless moment in 1911, when man's unrelenting dream to conquer the skies turned both breathtaking and tragic. The City of Lights had barely stirred from sleep as a small group gathered beneath the Eiffel Tower, its iron lattice rising against the pale dawn. Among them stood a man in a long overcoat, clutching not a suitcase or a notebook, but his invention, a peculiar contraption stitched with hope and daring. His name was Franz Reichelt, a tailor by profession, an inventor by obsession, and a dreamer by destiny. Born in Vienna, Austria, and later living in France, Reichelt was known in his neighborhood not for his suits, but for his strange fascination with flight. He was called Le Tailleur Volant, the Flying Tailor. And on that fateful day, his name would become legend, not for success, but for the sheer courage that defined the early chapters of human aviation, the age of flight and the dreamers it created. To understand Franz Reichelt, you have to step back into the mindset of the early 1900s, an era when flight wasn't a routine, but a miracle. The Wright brothers had only flown their first powered aircraft in 1903, less than a decade earlier. Every new flight, every daring test, felt like rewriting the laws of gravity itself. Europe, too, was gripped by aviation fever. Newspapers breathlessly reported on balloon ascents, dirigible crossings, and the latest airplane prototypes. The Eiffel Tower, once built as a symbol of architectural daring, had now become the stage for aerial experiments. And in this atmosphere of unbridled curiosity, tailors, mechanics, engineers, and dreamers all shared a single obsession: how to save a pilot when flight fails. Parachutes existed, yes, but they were bulky, made for balloonists, not aviators. Pilots who soared into the sky in fragile wooden machines had no safety device small enough to carry on board. And that's where Franz Reichelt saw his opportunity, a chance to stitch together humanity's next step toward safe flight. The flying suit Reichelt wasn't a scientist. He was a craftsman, a man who understood the flow of fabric, the tension of seams, and the way material caught the air. For years, he had worked quietly in his small tailor's shop on Rue Gaillon in Paris, turning silk and canvas into a contraption that combined fashion with physics, a parachute suit. It was supposed to be revolutionary, a wearable parachute that could unfold as the wearer jumped, gently slowing descent. He had tested it before, with dummies from small heights. And though results were mixed, he believed with all his heart that it could work. The newspapers had mocked him as eccentric. Fellow aviators had called him reckless. But Reichelt wasn't deterred. He saw himself as part of something bigger, the human race's quest to touch the sky safely. And so, when he sought permission to test his invention from the Eiffel Tower, the French authorities agreed, assuming he would use a dummy, as most inventors did. But Reichelt had other plans. The morning of the flight, it was bitterly cold when he arrived beneath the Eiffel Tower that morning. Witnesses recalled seeing him pacing nervously, measuring the air with his gaze. He wore his invention proudly, a bulky bird-like suit made of silk and rubberized fabric weighing nearly 9 kilograms. To onlookers, it looked absurd, part wings, part cloak, part straitjacket. Reporters and photographers were already waiting. Reichelt had invited them himself. After all, what good was a historic breakthrough without an audience? He smiled for the cameras, though tension flickered behind his eyes. As he adjusted his collar and gloves, one journalist asked if he truly intended to jump himself. He answered calmly in French, "Oui, I will prove the worth of my invention." The guards hesitated. They had expected a mannequin, not a man. But Reichelt insisted. This was his dream, his creation, and his risk to take. At 8:22 a.m., he began his slow, deliberate climb up the iron staircase of the Eiffel Tower. The metal rang beneath his boots. The wind bit harder the higher he went. And by the time he reached the first platform, about 57 meters above ground, even the bravest spectators held their breath. The leap below, the small crowd gathered in a semicircle. A mix of engineers, journalists, policemen, and curious Parisians. Cameras were positioned. The air was still. Then, from the edge of the platform, Franz Reichelt appeared, his suit fluttering lightly in the breeze, a faint silhouette against the Paris skyline. He tested the air with his hands, looked down once, then back toward the horizon. For a long, haunting moment, he stood motionless, a tailor about to challenge the heavens. Then, without a word, he leapt. The suit spread open briefly, wings catching the wind. But within seconds, it collapsed inward, wrapping around his body like a cocoon. The wind howled, the crowd gasped, and in a heartbeat, it was over. Franz Reichelt hit the frozen ground at the foot of the tower. The sound was dreadful. He was killed instantly. A journalist who witnessed it wrote, "There was a dull thud, then silence. For a moment, no one moved. The aftermath. The crowd rushed forward. Police officers surrounded the site. Reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras had captured everything: the preparation, the hesitation, the leap, and the fall. Within hours, photographs and silent film reels of the flying tailor spread across Europe. Some called it a tragedy. Others called it folly. But for those who understood the spirit of invention, it was something else entirely, a testament to courage, to belief, to humanity's relentless urge to test the impossible. Reichelt's experiment failed, yes, but his death sparked renewed interest in parachute design. Aviation pioneers studied his suit, improved upon it, and within years, compact parachutes became a standard part of flight safety. His leap, though fatal, contributed in its own way to saving countless lives later. The dual nature of heroism. There's a haunting beauty in the story of Franz Reichelt. He wasn't a celebrity, a soldier, or a scientist with government funding. He was a tailor, an ordinary man who refused to accept that the sky was unreachable. In every era of progress, there are those like him, the ones who risk everything for an idea. Some succeed and are celebrated. Others fail and are forgotten. But both push humanity forward. Reichelt's fall reminds us that innovation is never purely about success. It's about the courage to try when others laugh, to climb when others doubt, to jump when others watch. Legacy and reflection. Today, more than a century later, the grainy black and white footage of Franz Reichelt's jump still exists. You can see him adjusting his suit, stepping to the edge, pausing, and then falling. Watching it, even knowing the outcome, is unsettling. But it also stirs something deeper: admiration. Because Reichelt's tragedy is part of the origin story of human flight. A story written not only by the Wright brothers and engineers in labs, but also by dreamers who stitched their hopes into fabric. In his small Paris apartment, where he once cut and sewed his parachute material by hand, Reichelt had kept sketches, notes, and measurements. They found calculations scrawled in the margins: air resistance, surface area, terminal velocity. He wasn't a fool. He was learning, adapting, experimenting. He just took one leap too soon. The man who fell and yet rose. Every inventor risks failure. Every dreamer flirts with disaster. But not every failure becomes immortal. Franz Reichelt's story has survived not because of the spectacle of his fall, but because of the purity of his intent. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune. He was chasing possibility. He believed that humans could fly, or at least land safely if they fell trying. And in that belief lies a strange kind of triumph. The Eiffel Tower, once his launch pad, now bears no plaque of his attempt, but his name lives on in aviation circles, history books, and documentaries as a symbol of raw courage. Because in every technological success, there's a shadow of someone who tried and failed first, someone who dared to jump, someone who believed. When you stand beneath the Eiffel Tower today, surrounded by tourists and laughter, it is hard to imagine that this place, this monument of love and engineering, was once the site of such a somber moment. Yet, if you look up at that first platform, you might feel a flicker of what Franz Reichelt felt that morning: the pulse of adrenaline, the weight of invention, the thrill of defiance. He didn't survive his dream, but his dream survived him. In that sense, the flying tailor didn't fall. He ascended into the timeless realm of those who dared to push the edge of human capability. As the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire once wrote, "Come to the edge," he said. "We can't, we're afraid," they replied. "Come to the edge," he said. They came. He pushed them, and they flew. Franz Reichelt didn't fly that morning, but because of men like him, we all do now. Number 13. The death of Horatio Nelson, 1805. October 21st, 1805. The winds were fierce, the seas restless, and history was about to immortalize one of Britain's greatest heroes, Admiral Horatio Nelson. The day that marked the Battle of Trafalgar also became the day of his death, sealing his name forever in the annals of courage, sacrifice, and national pride. The sun rose over the Atlantic waters off Cape Trafalgar, Spain, casting golden light upon two mighty fleets. The British Royal Navy on one side and the combined forces of France and Spain on the other. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe, and control of the seas meant control of empires. But Nelson, ever the visionary, was not one to be intimidated by numbers or odds. Facing 33 enemy ships with just 27 of his own, he had already made peace with fate. What mattered to him was victory and the freedom of Britain. The calm before the storm. On that fateful morning, Nelson stood aboard his flagship, HMS Victory, dressed in his Admiral's uniform adorned with medals, a decision that made him easily identifiable to enemy sharpshooters. Yet Nelson was not a man who hid from danger. To him, leadership meant visibility, the courage to stand where others feared. He took out his telescope and observed the enemy formation through the mist. His second-in-command, Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, awaited the order. Then Nelson uttered the command that would echo through time. England expects that every man will do his duty. The signal flags rose high, flapping in the brisk wind. It was more than a message. It was a call to the soul of every sailor aboard those ships. You could feel the morale surge, the tension break into determination. The men cheered. They knew this battle would define the course of history. The clash of titans. By late morning, the silence of anticipation shattered into thunder. Cannon fire roared across the waves. The smell of gunpowder and splintered wood filled the air as cannonballs tore through masts and hulls. The HMS Victory, battered but unyielding, broke through the French line under heavy fire. Nelson's unconventional tactics, breaking the enemy line in two columns rather than fighting parallel, were risky but revolutionary. The maneuver confused the Franco-Spanish fleet, turning order into chaos. Ships collided, sails caught fire, and men scrambled amidst the carnage. From his position on deck, Nelson calmly issued orders, his composure unwavering even as death circled him. His officers described him as serene, as if observing a rehearsal rather than fighting a war. That calm confidence inspired his men to fight with unmatched ferocity. The shot that changed history. At around 1:15 p.m., as Nelson paced the deck beside his flag captain Thomas Hardy, a French sniper aboard the Redoubtable took aim through the smoke. A single musket ball whistled through the air and struck Nelson in the shoulder, tearing through his spine and lodging in his chest. He fell instantly. Hardy caught him, and Nelson whispered, "They have done for me at last, Hardy." He was carried below deck, the chaos of battle thundering above. Even in his final moments, Nelson's concern was not for himself, but for his men, and the outcome of the fight. "How goes the battle?" he asked repeatedly. Hardy reassured him, "We've gained the victory." With faint breath, Nelson responded, "Thank God I have done my duty." Those were his last words. The price of victory above deck. The British fleet had decimated the enemy. 22 enemy ships were captured or destroyed, and not a single British ship was lost. The Battle of Trafalgar ensured Britain's naval dominance for more than a century to come. But victory came at a heartbreaking cost. When news of Nelson's death spread through the fleet, hardened sailors wept openly. The hero who had led them through victory after victory was gone. Yet even in death, he had achieved what he always desired, the security of his nation and eternal honor. His body was preserved in a barrel of brandy for the long voyage back to England, a macabre but practical act to ensure his people could bid him farewell. When the ship HMS Victory arrived at Portsmouth, thousands lined the docks in solemn silence. The entire nation went into mourning. A nation in mourning. In January 1806, London witnessed one of the most grand and emotional funerals in its history. The procession carried Nelson's coffin from Greenwich to St. Paul's Cathedral, where he was laid to rest beneath its great dome. Bells tolled, flags flew at half-mast, and people of all classes, from noblemen to dock workers, filled the streets, some weeping openly. King George III himself declared that Nelson had left a name immortal. The Parliament granted his family titles and pensions, while artists, poets, and composers across Britain created works in his honor. Legacy of a hero. Nelson's death wasn't just the loss of a man, it was the birth of a legend. His leadership redefined naval warfare. His strategy at Trafalgar became the cornerstone of maritime military training for generations. His name became synonymous with courage, innovation, and unyielding patriotism. Even today, when one stands before Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, London, looking up at the Admiral statue watching over the city, it's hard not to feel the weight of that legacy. He stands there not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of Britain's history, a reminder of what it means to give everything for duty and country. Nelson's story has since inspired countless films, novels, and historical documentaries. But beyond the myth, there remains the man, a complex figure of passion, bravery, and humanity. He was flawed, emotional, deeply driven by love for his country, and equally devoted to those he led. Cinematic reflections. In a cinematic sense, Nelson's final moments read like the ending of a grand historical epic, the lone hero fulfilling his destiny amidst fire, sea spray, and chaos. His death, though tragic, felt almost poetic. The victory was his swan song, his final gift to the empire he served. The image of HMS Victory slicing through the waves, cannons booming as Nelson lay dying below deck, embodies the perfect contrast between triumph and tragedy, the light and shadow that define great history. Epilogue. More than 2 centuries later, the echoes of that day still linger. Trafalgar remains one of the most studied battles in military history. The courage of Horatio Nelson continues to inspire leaders, soldiers, and dreamers alike. He was not just an admiral, he was a man who understood that greatness comes with sacrifice. That duty often demands everything. As the sea gently laps against the shores of Cape Trafalgar, one might imagine the spirit of Nelson still watching, forever guarding the waters he once commanded, forever whispering through the waves, "England expects that every man will do his duty." Number 14. The death of Horatio Nelson, 1805. October 21st, 1805. The winds were fierce, the seas restless, and history was about to immortalize one of Britain's greatest heroes, Admiral Horatio Nelson. The day that marked the Battle of Trafalgar also became the day of his death, sealing his name forever in the annals of courage, sacrifice, and national pride. The sun rose over the Atlantic waters off Cape Trafalgar, Spain, casting golden light upon 2 mighty fleets. The British Royal Navy on one side and the combined forces of France and Spain on the other. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe, and control of the seas meant control of empires. But Nelson, ever the visionary, was not one to be intimidated by numbers or odds. Facing 33 enemy ships with just 27 of his own, he had already made peace with fate. What mattered to him was victory and the freedom of Britain. The calm before the storm. On that fateful morning, Nelson stood aboard his flagship, HMS Victory, dressed in his Admiral's uniform adorned with medals, a decision that made him easily identifiable to enemy sharpshooters. Yet Nelson was not a man who hid from danger. To him, leadership meant visibility, the courage to stand where others feared. He took out his telescope and observed the enemy formation through the mist. His second-in-command, Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, awaited the order. Then Nelson uttered the command that would echo through time. England expects that every man will do his duty. The signal flags rose high, flapping in the brisk wind. It was more than a message. It was a call to the soul of every sailor aboard those ships. You could feel the morale surge, the tension break into determination. The men cheered. They knew this battle would define the course of history. The clash of titans. By late morning, the silence of anticipation shattered into thunder. Cannon fire roared across the waves. The smell of gunpowder and splintered wood filled the air as cannonballs tore through masts and hulls. The HMS Victory, battered but unyielding, broke through the French line under heavy fire. Nelson's unconventional tactics, breaking the enemy line in two columns rather than fighting parallel, were risky but revolutionary. The maneuver confused the Franco-Spanish fleet, turning order into chaos. Ships collided, sails caught fire, and men scrambled amidst the carnage. From his position on deck, Nelson calmly issued orders, his composure unwavering even as death circled him. His officers described him as serene, as if observing a rehearsal rather than fighting a war. That calm confidence inspired his men to fight with unmatched ferocity. The shot that changed history. At around 1:15 p.m., as Nelson paced the deck beside his flag captain Thomas Hardy, a French sniper aboard the Redoubtable took aim through the smoke. A single musket ball whistled through the air and struck Nelson in the shoulder, tearing through his spine and lodging in his chest. He fell instantly. Hardy caught him, and Nelson whispered, "They have done for me at last, Hardy." He was carried below deck, the chaos of battle thundering above. Even in his final moments, Nelson's concern was not for himself, but for his men, and the outcome of the fight. "How goes the battle?" he asked repeatedly. Hardy reassured him, "We've gained the victory." With faint breath, Nelson responded, "Thank God I have done my duty." Those were his last words. The price of victory above deck. The British fleet had decimated the enemy. 22 enemy ships were captured or destroyed, and not a single British ship was lost. The Battle of Trafalgar ensured Britain's naval dominance for more than a century to come. But victory came at a heartbreaking cost. When news of Nelson's death spread through the fleet, hardened sailors wept openly. The hero who had led them through victory after victory was gone. Yet even in death, he had achieved what he always desired, the security of his nation and eternal honor. His body was preserved in a barrel of brandy for the long voyage back to England, a macabre but practical act to ensure his people could bid him farewell. When the ship HMS Victory arrived at Portsmouth, thousands lined the docks in solemn silence. The entire nation went into mourning. A nation in mourning. In January 1806, London witnessed one of the most grand and emotional funerals in its history. The procession carried Nelson's coffin from Greenwich to St. Paul's Cathedral, where he was laid to rest beneath its great dome. Bells tolled, flags flew at half-mast, and people of all classes, from noblemen to dock workers, filled the streets, some weeping openly. King George III himself declared that Nelson had left a name immortal. The Parliament granted his family titles and pensions, while artists, poets, and composers across Britain created works in his honor. Legacy of a hero. Nelson's death wasn't just the loss of a man, it was the birth of a legend. His leadership redefined naval warfare. His strategy at Trafalgar became the cornerstone of maritime military training for generations. His name became synonymous with courage, innovation, and unyielding patriotism. Even today, when one stands before Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, London, looking up at the Admiral statue watching over the city, it's hard not to feel the weight of that legacy. He stands there not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of Britain's history, a reminder of what it means to give everything for duty and country. Nelson's story has since inspired countless films, novels, and historical documentaries. But beyond the myth, there remains the man, a complex figure of passion, bravery, and humanity. He was flawed, emotional, deeply driven by love for his country, and equally devoted to those he led. In a cinematic sense, Nelson's final moments read like the ending of a grand historical epic. The lone hero fulfilling his destiny amidst fire, sea spray, and chaos. His death, though tragic, felt almost poetic. The victory was his swan song, his final gift to the empire he served. The image of HMS Victory slicing through the waves, cannons booming as Nelson lay dying below deck, embodies the perfect contrast between triumph and tragedy, the light and shadow that define great history. Epilogue. More than 2 centuries later, the echoes of that day still linger. Trafalgar remains one of the most studied battles in military history. The courage of Horatio Nelson continues to inspire leaders, soldiers, and dreamers alike. He was not just an admiral. He was a man who understood that greatness comes with sacrifice. That duty often demands everything. As the sea gently laps against the shores of Cape Trafalgar, one might imagine the spirit of Nelson still watching, forever guarding the waters he once commanded, forever whispering through the waves. England expects that every man will do his duty. Number 15. NASA's Orion capsule test completed, 2014. The 21st of October, 2014. A day that marked not the end of a journey, but the thrilling rebirth of humanity's greatest ambition, to reach farther than ever before. On this day, NASA successfully completed a major test of the Orion spacecraft, the vessel designed to carry humankind beyond the moon, toward Mars, and perhaps one day beyond even that. It was the first real spark of a new space age, where humanity once again dared to dream of setting foot among the stars. When the Orion capsule roared to life on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, Florida, the world looked on with bated breath. The sight was both familiar and new, a reminder of the Apollo era's golden flames, but wrapped in the technology of a new century. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like just another test. But for those who understood the magnitude of what Orion represented, this was nothing short of the opening act of a cosmic epic. A new dawn after a quiet sky. After the Space Shuttle program retired in 2011, NASA's skies had grown eerily quiet. The shuttles, Atlantis, Discovery, Endeavour, once the pride of American ingenuity, now rested in museums, their heat shield tiles kissed by history. For a time, it felt as though humanity's boundless curiosity had hit a pause button. The early 2010s were uncertain years for space exploration. Funding cuts, shifting priorities, and a growing reliance on private companies left many wondering if NASA's glory days were behind it. But the agency had been quietly building something extraordinary, a spacecraft not just for low Earth orbit, but for deep space. Enter Orion, the sleek, conical capsule capable of carrying astronauts 4,000 miles beyond Earth, farther than any spacecraft built for humans since the Apollo missions. It was the next generation answer to an age-old question: what's next after the moon? And on that October day, NASA proved the answer was Mars. The science of courage. The test wasn't just about flying, it was about surviving. Spaceflight, after all, isn't merely a feat of engineering. It is a test of endurance against an unforgiving void. During the 2014 test, Orion was launched atop a Delta IV Heavy rocket, the most powerful in NASA's arsenal at the time. The objective was to send the capsule into orbit, push it to nearly 3,600 miles above Earth, about 15 times higher than the International Space Station, and then bring it safely back through the atmosphere at a fiery 20,000 miles per hour. The heat shield, nearly 5 meters wide, was the star of the show. Designed to withstand temperatures of 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it had to ensure the capsule could survive the searing descent. The same kind of heat astronauts would face returning from deep space. It was a flawless performance. As the capsule splashed down into the Pacific Ocean, NASA scientists cheered, some with tears in their eyes. One engineer later said, "We saw our future falling from the sky, and it survived." Carrying humanity's dream. The symbolism of Orion went far beyond metal, wires, and fuel. This capsule carried humanity's oldest longing: exploration. From the sailors of Magellan to the pilots of Apollo, each generation has found its frontier. In the 1960s, the moon became our destination. In the 2010s, Mars was next. But Mars wasn't just another red dot in the sky anymore. It was a goal, a destination that NASA and the world were actively preparing for. Orion was the vessel to get us there. Inside its sleek interior, the capsule was built for endurance and safety. It could hold 4 astronauts for weeks in deep space. Its systems were designed to function autonomously for long missions. Every control, every button, every air valve had one goal: to protect the lives of the explorers inside. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story? Humanity wasn't doing it alone this time. The European Space Agency, ESA, had partnered with NASA to provide the Orion S service module, a global collaboration in the spirit of exploration. Space, once the domain of rivalry, was now a frontier of unity. Echoes of Apollo, visions of tomorrow. There's an almost poetic connection between the Orion capsule and the Apollo command modules of the 1960s. Both shared that bullet-shaped design, not for nostalgia, but because it worked. Aerodynamics, physics, and the laws of re-entry remain the same no matter how advanced our technology becomes. Yet there's something distinctly modern about Orion. The capsule is built using state-of-the-art alloys, advanced avionics, and computer systems that make Apollo's controls look like museum relics. It's a perfect blend of the past's bravery and the future's innovation. NASA's engineers even embedded symbolic tributes into Orion. On one test capsule, a small patch honoring the Apollo 1 astronauts, who perished during a ground test in 1967, was placed beneath the heat shield. It would burn up during re-entry, as if their sacrifice literally protected the next generation. That is the kind of emotional weight that makes space exploration more than science. It is storytelling written across the stars. The Mars connection. Why Mars? Why not return to the moon where we've already been? Because Mars represents the next step. It's a planet where we might one day plant crops, build habitats, and live beneath alien skies. It's where scientists hope to uncover whether life, even microbial, ever existed beyond Earth. The Orion test of 2014 was designed to pave the way for the Artemis missions, NASA's ambitious plan to return humans to the moon and then use it as a launch point for Mars. Artemis I, an uncrewed mission that circled the moon in 2022, directly built upon the success of this 2014 test. In many ways, October 21, 2014, became the foundation stone for the future of human spaceflight. Without that successful test, Artemis might never have taken off. Without Artemis, the dream of walking on Mars might still be fantasy. Why it matters. The Orion capsule test wasn't just an engineering triumph, it was an emotional one. It reminded the world that space isn't yet a thing of the past, it is still our destiny. When the capsule splashed down that day, the world briefly paused to look up again, to remember that we are, at our core, explorers. Children watched in classrooms. Retired NASA veterans smiled, seeing their legacy live on. And across the world, millions quietly dreamed again of standing on alien soil. The test didn't just prove Orion could fly, it proved humanity still wants to fly. Legacy and continuation. As of today, the Orion capsule has gone on to achieve even greater milestones. Its later tests have taken it beyond the moon. It stands as the beating heart of NASA's Artemis program, which aims to send humans back to the lunar surface, and ultimately to Mars in the 2030s. But every future triumph will always trace its roots back to that October day in 2014, the day the quiet skies came alive again. When you think about it, history often repeats itself, but not in circles, in spirals. The Orion test was a higher turn of the same spiral that began with the Wright brothers, soared through Apollo, and now reaches for Mars. And somewhere out there, a child who watched that launch in 2014 might be the astronaut who steps onto Mars tomorrow. That's the real legacy of Orion, not the capsule, but the courage it inspires. October 21st, the day we reached for the stars. And there you have it. October 21st, a day that proves history doesn't move in straight lines. It dances, it loops, it surprises us. From the smoke and thunder of Trafalgar, where Horatio Nelson gave his life for glory, to the trembling hope inside. NASA's Orion capsule as it carried our dreams toward Mars. This single date has witnessed the courage, creativity, and curiosity that define who we are as humans. Think about it. On this day, centuries apart, men and women dared to challenge the limits of their time. Alfred Nobel turned destruction into legacy. Ernest Hemingway captured the soul of endurance. Dizzy Gillespie gave jazz its heartbeat. Carrie Fisher showed the world that heroes come in all forms. And somewhere between those pages of history, the Orion capsule reminded us that the sky is not the limit, it is just the beginning. Each October 21st, We were reminded that greatness doesn't happen overnight. It is written one daring act at a time, whether in the ink of authors, the fire of invention, or the silence of space. Every story on this date echoes the same message. Dream fearlessly, create endlessly, and never stop looking up. Because even when the stars seem distant, someone, somewhere, is building the next rocket to reach them. If you enjoyed traveling through time with us today, don't stop here. Head over to our October 19th episode, where history took an unexpected turn with war, invention, and intrigue. And get ready for October 22nd, because what happened that day will absolutely blow your mind. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss a single day in history that changed the world. Join our growing community of curious minds, because tomorrow we'll uncover another chapter of humanity's incredible story. Until then, keep wondering, keep questioning, and keep your eyes on the stars. This is A Day in History, where every sunrise brings another story worth remembering. Next episode, October 22nd, the secrets, the legends, the turning points.